Federal prosecutors say three powerful brothers, Alon, Tal, and Alon Alexander, ran a years-long sex trafficking ring, drugging, raping dozens of women and girls, including a minor. A newly unsealed superseding indictment reveals disturbing new details and allegations of what they call a calculated high-end trafficking operation. And I'm going to break it all down right now with someone who knows a thing or two about advanced sexual abuse cases. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots or were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or head over to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. For over a decade, three powerful brothers allegedly used their wealth, their connections, their carefully crafted public images to lure, drug, and sexually assault dozens of women and girls. These are the allegations from prosecutors. And now, federal prosecutors have unveiled a shocking superseding indictment against real estate moguls Alon and Tal Alexander, along with their brother Alon, revealing just disturbing new details about what they describe as a brutal and premeditated sex trafficking conspiracy. Now, these new charges, which were filed on May 8th in the Southern District of New York, they allege a pattern of drugging, raping, coercing women, including one underage girl, across state and international lines. And we're going to be talking about the allegations dating back to 2009. But this latest indictment tacks on 6 additional charges from the previous indictment that was filed in New York federal court. And these guys, once celebrated in elite social circles, these brothers saw their empire fall in December of 2024 when they were arrested during a morning FBI raid at their Miami Beach homes. The initial indictment charged them with trafficking 2 women, but prosecutors now say the scheme was far more extensive. Alon and Tal, they were star brokers at Douglas Elliman before launching their own firm called Official, where they brokered record-breaking deals, including a $240 million Manhattan penthouse sale. Alon worked in private security, but according to prosecutors, still allegedly participated in this trafficking ring. And all 3 are currently being held in Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center. And now, this superseding indictment outlines a years-long alleged operation. It reads, quote, to carry out and facilitate their sex trafficking scheme, Alon Alexander, Alon Alexander, and Tal Alexander, the defendants, used deception, fraud, and coercion to cause victims to travel with them or meet them in private locations. Thereafter, the Alexander brothers used various methods, including drugging the victims and at times physical force to rape and sexually assault the victims, sometimes alone and sometimes together. Now, we have the indictment. We're going to go through all of these details and the law as well. But first, I want to bring on a special guest to help me break it all down. I'm joined by sex abuse attorney and former prosecutor John Clune. John, thank you so much for coming on. And for those of you who don't know, John is recognized as one of the nation's top sexual abuse attorneys. So really, really happy to have your perspective on this.
Thanks, Chad. I'm glad to be here.
Let's first start. What's a superseding indictment? For people who don't know, what is it? Why is it important? And also, this is a good question. Why not just file all of these charges initially back in December? I mean, why wait several months? Why not just wait to charge them with everything they were planning on charging them with?
Right. So, I mean, a superseding indictment is basically like an amended complaint. It's showing that they had additional information that came forward, and so they went back to the grand jury and asked the grand jury if they found a basis for these additional charges. Why they didn't do it all at once? It could just be that this is a kind of unfolding investigation, and they didn't have the information that they have now at the time that they made the initial indictment.
In other words, once you charge somebody, additional people may come forward, or during your investigation, particularly through obtaining evidence, you may uncover additional crimes or alleged crimes.
Right, and we see it a lot in some of these more high-profile cases where there's an initial indictment and then there's a flurry of media coverage that covers that indictment, and then more victims come forward. It can end up being a pattern that takes a while before you get to the final indictment that charges all the crimes. So there's no saying that this is going to be the last of the charges that we see for the Alexander brothers.
And when you're talking allegations back to 2009, we had the same conversation in the Diddy case. How does this not impact the statute of limitations? Is that because you may have older claims, but the federal charges, there are no statute of limitations?
That's exactly right. For sex trafficking, for the federal sex trafficking claims, there is no statute of limitations, so they can go back as long as they find the information.
But you still deal with the same kind of issues: memory, lack of evidence, right? Corroboration. And older the claim, the weaker the case for the prosecution sometimes.
That certainly can be. I mean, 2009 isn't. I mean, that's a lot. It's 16 years ago, but it's. We've seen cases from much older time spans where it really becomes challenging. So we'll have to see. But in general, you'd rather have witnesses that are fresh, that have good memories, that have had consistent accounts of what happened. But we'll have to see how this plays out.
It's when I started law school. That's how long that ago was. My gosh, a long time ago. All right. So let's get right into count one. So the conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. I would argue that this is the foundation for this whole indictment. So this indictment reads, quote, collectively, the Alexander brothers, the defendants, worked together and with others, known and unknown, to repeatedly and violently drug, sexually assault, and rape dozens of female victims. So, John, when you see the indictment references dozens, yet there are only, 6 alleged identified victims, even though they're not being identified per se, there's victim 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Does that mean that you're going to see additional charges with other victims? Does that mean that you might have more people testify who are just not named as a alleged victim per se? How does it, when you see a case say multiple victims, including alleged victim 1 and alleged victim 2, what does that mean?
It probably means the latter that you suggested, that we're going to see the possibility of a number of other women testifying in the case that are not necessarily victims of charged counts. Usually, if you're going to say that there's dozens of women who have been victimized, if their charges are going to come out, you're not going to mention them until you're actually filing the charges. So the fact that this indictment has come forward and they're mentioning dozens of victims, that's a signal to me that they're going to be admitted as witnesses to show some sort of pattern of conduct.
Why not just have, I don't know how many they believe they have, but just for argument's sake, if they think they have like 20, why not just have alleged victims 1 through 20 and have them all identified and have separate charges? Why only list 6?
Yeah, it could be that the grand jury didn't feel like they had enough information about the other women. It could be that the prosecution didn't present sufficient information to the grand jury. Remember, the grand jury is the one who's making the decision on these charges.
Right.
So it's either the grand jury didn't see that there was enough, or maybe the prosecution thought that some of the cases would be harder to prove for one reason or another, and so they didn't focus on those with the grand jury.
I want to ask you about the sex trafficking. Okay, so we spoke to the defense attorney who's representing Tal Alexander. Her name is Diane. And here's what she had to say regarding these latest allegations. Quote, the new superseding indictment changes nothing. It's a reheated version of the same case and still does not include conduct that amounts to federal sex trafficking. The government is trying to stretch a statute beyond recognition to fit a narrative, not a crime. So when you hear that argument, John, right, this doesn't amount to federal sex trafficking, what would you say as a former prosecutor? Because when you think about it from a defense perspective, do you think there's grounds to say, how is this a commercial sex act? How is it that force, fraud, and coercion were being used? I mean, is this a unique way to charge individual? Because I think the classic, I've always talked about this a lot with people, when people think sex trafficking, they think of this shadowy organization that kidnaps young girls from another country, sells them to other people. This is a little different. What's your response to that defense that you heard from Tal Alexander's attorney?
Yeah, it's an interesting point that she makes, and I think the devil is going to be in the details on this one. I mean, it sounds like, this is somewhat reading between the lines of the complaint or the indictment. The actual, commercial sex act we usually think of as, kind of more traditional prostitution, maybe pornography, that sort of thing. This sounds like there is the allegation. It has to do with kind of non-traditional payments to women by either promising them certain trips or certain luxury items, maybe some payments after the fact in the form of concert tickets or other types of gifts. It is definitely not the traditional way to charge sex trafficking or the traditional facts that support sex trafficking. But I mean, it seems to qualify under the statute. What a jury thinks of it could be a different story.
Well, look, the allegations are heinous. So what I'm about to say doesn't take away from what the allegations are. But if somebody says I was in a romantic relationship with somebody, they took me on a trip, they paid for my meals, they bought me clothing, they bought me jewelry, and they also sexually assaulted me, you could say that's a classic sexual assault case at a state level. Could they also be charged with sex trafficking? Because if you look at, the conspiracy charge, right, it explains how the brothers conspired to recruit or harbor or transport these women to benefit financially, receive something of value from participating in this venture. You tell me what you think that might be, because the counter argument is, again, they partied with these women, they traveled with them, they brought them drinks, airfare, lodging. How is this sex trafficking? So I guess the question is it being extended beyond what it was meant to be?
I think that what the prosecution is probably looking at is if these women are being fraudulently promised something like, these luxury trips or whatever else is being used to induce them to come to these parties or come to these events. And really the plan all along was to drug them and rape them. That would seem to be consistent with sex trafficking. There may be a different version of events from the defense, but if that's what they're basing it on, it doesn't seem like that much of a stretch from the more historical use of sex trafficking, which is maybe say you promise, migrant workers, work when they get to the U.S. and it turns out they have to live in a brothel. That may be like an easier way to wrap your head around sex trafficking.
Right.
But if these women are being promised something to come to these events, and really the plan all along is for them to be raped, that would seem to qualify.
For this charge, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, is it? And hopefully I'm reading it correctly. Do the defendants, the brothers, have to benefit financially from this, receive something of value from participating in this venture?
They don't have to receive anything of value from participating in, but there does have to be some sort of evidence of the conspiracy. I mean, you do have to be able to show that there was some sort of communication or agreement between the two of them, the three of them, to do this sort of thing.
Okay, and that's probably where you talk about the devil in the details, the alleged text messages between them talking about what they're planning, what they're procuring. Those would be the allegations. But I want to continue looking at count one here, because the indictment lists a bunch of overt acts, so these specific methods that the brothers allegedly used to further this conspiracy. When you're talking conspiracy, it's not just an agreement, you have to take certain steps. So those are luxury recruitment, drugging, physical restraint, interstate transport, third-party involvement. For luxury recruitment, the indictment reads, at times, the Alexander brothers arranged for these sexual acts well in advance using the promise of luxury experience, travel, and accommodations to lure and entice female victims to locations where they were forcibly raped or sexually assaulted. We talked about that. They're further accused of drugging victims with substances as strong as GHB. The indictment alleges in advance of the events, the Alexander brothers and others procured drugs that they agreed to provide to the women and girls, including, among other things, cocaine, mushrooms, and GHB. On multiple occasions during these events and trips, the Alexander brothers and others surreptitiously drugged female victims' drinks. So you're seeing how this is now escalating beyond just what I was talking about before, a classic example. But again, John, just thinking about defenses here, if we are talking about mind-altering substances being involved, does that affect a victim's credibility at all? If some of the alleged victims were under the influence of substances, can we rely on their accounts?
Well, it's a good question. It depends on what the evidence is that they have, and we just don't know that at this point. I mean, it's not uncommon to prosecute even just traditional sexual assaults that have the use of date rape drugs, and there's other things that you can do to corroborate. Even the fact that if there is something like GHB in somebody's system, that certainly looks like evidence of something that's non-consensual or a sexual assault versus, somebody who just was intoxicated or something like that. So it certainly can be done. We'll have to wait and see what the evidence is.
If they might have felt something afterwards or said something to someone afterwards or were told something afterwards, you can put two and two together. I mean, how many times do we have cases that are circumstantial evidence? We might have in a murder case a video of somebody actually stabbing somebody, right? But you put the circumstances together and you can understand what might have ultimately happened here. Again, innocent until proven guilty, but you're seeing how prosecutors are going to move forward with it. Now, I mean, because one of the things it says is some of the victims experience symptoms of impaired physical and mental capacity, including limitations of movement and speech and incomplete memories of events. So just something to keep in mind. Then we have this aspect of physical restraint. So the indictment mentions that allegedly, at times, the defendants physically restrained and held down their victims during the rapes and sexual assaults and ignored screams and explicit requests to stop. Now, how does that language, John, change the whole game for prosecutors?
From an optics standpoint, it makes the nature of these sexual assaults more horrific. It certainly was inflammatory, I would presume, with the grand jury and could be with the regular jury as well. But it also feeds into the element of force for sex trafficking.
Yes, force, fraud, coercion. And as for interstate transportation, quote, on some occasions, after the women and girls accepted the invitations to attend a particular event, the Alexander brothers transported women and girls and caused women and girls to be transported across state and international lines. Why is that important? Is that a necessary element for any sex trafficking case? Why is that important?
It's not necessary for a sex trafficking case, for the actual elements of sex trafficking, but it is for another type of charge in the federal law that hasn't been charged. So I'm not entirely clear why it's something that's referenced in the complaint. If there's a legal requirement for it, Jesse, it's not something that I'm aware of.
By the way, we're going to jump back to John in a second, but after we did this interview, he threw us a little note, said that he thinks the trafficking across state lines issue is what gives the feds jurisdiction. Now, it's not required for the crime, but without it, it would probably be a state trafficking issue. All right, let's go back to John. It's in the Diddy case, too, so I guess that question of transportation is key. I want to ask you about this, though, the network. So it's mentioned this network, right? Others known, unknown. Who could they be referring to, and why are those people not charged alongside the Alexander brothers?
Yeah, look, a lot of times in these kind of, if we can call them sex trafficking rings, which we don't know if that's fair or not, but in other types of cases where we do have sex trafficking rings, there are often a number of other very wealthy individuals that are participants in these parties, that are participants in the sexual assault. Can be friends, colleagues, that sort of thing, but we just don't have enough information to know.
Yeah, it says the defendants and other men attending the trips pooled financial resources in order to pay for flights and other travel expenses for the women and girls. It makes me wonder, same question I had in the Diddy case, is do you have people who are cooperating with the government, right? And are going to make those ties and maybe help explain certain financial transactions or wire transfers or other ways of sharing money, or what it means by pooling resources and why they spent money the way that they did. I have to imagine that they need more cooperators in a case like this to really get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. That's a common thing in particularly in federal prosecution of these types of claims. There could be more charges for individuals, but sometimes with those cooperating individuals, you wait and see what their level of cooperation is, how much that cooperation helps the prosecution, and then if there are charges for those individuals, we'll see them more towards the end of the case.
Yeah, it says the defendants and other men organizing the trip then contacted the women and girls, including through social media or dating applications, and induced the women and girls to attend by, among other things, offering to purchase their flights, making other travel arrangements, and or providing accommodations without charge. So now I want to move on to the other counts here. So the counts are all generally read the same here, except for count 5, which we're going to get into. But for example, you have count 2. Accuses Tal Alexander of sex trafficking a woman referred to as victim 1 around July of 2011. Counts 3 and 4 accuse all the brothers of sex trafficking a woman referred to as victim 2 and also inducing her to travel from Illinois to New York to engage in unlawful sexual activity. That's around September of 2016. Counts 6 and 7 allege that all 3 brothers trafficked women referred to as victims 4 and 5. That's around June of 2009. And counts 8 and 9 allege that Tal trafficked a woman referred to as victim 6, lured her from Nevada to New York. That's around August of 2014. But count 5 is a unique one in that it accuses Alon and Tal of trafficking a minor referred to as victim 3 in May of 2009. I want to get into all this right now. I want to start with the alleged minor one, because that's incredibly serious and different from the others. Because according to the indictment, it says in May of 2009, Tal and Tal Alexander allegedly trafficked a girl who was a minor under 18 years of age, and something in the indictment reads, having had reasonable opportunity to observe the person, that the person had not attained the age of 18 years. John, what does that mean? Reasonable opportunity to observe that the person had not attained the age of 18 years.
So in a lot of child sex assault charges, you have a requirement of knowing that the victim is actually not of age to consent. In these federal sex trafficking statutes, it's slightly different. You've had reasonable opportunity to observe this person. So that's the only requirement. It's not that you knew that they were underage. It's that you had the opportunity to observe this individual and they are not underage. So it's a lower requirement for showing your culpability in terms of your mental state of knowing whether or not the person was under 18 or under the age of consent.
For hypothetical purposes, if that alleged victim told them that she was 20 years old or 20, okay, or if someone told them, hey, she's 20 years old, I checked her ID and she had a fake ID. I don't know the circumstances of this, but I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Would that be sufficient to overcome this and defend this charge?
It could. I think that it depends on the age of the child and what they look like. If you have an 8-year-old saying they're 20 years old, then that's not going to fly. But if you have somebody who looks like they could be, of a negligible age around the age of consent, and the facts that you just laid out were evident, then that certainly could be a defense to the charge.
And the problem with this charge for them, right? The problem with this, well, for one of these brothers, is the no consent defense, right? So consent could be a defense to all of the other sex trafficking charges, but when you're dealing with an alleged minor, that doesn't work anymore. And then, correct me if I'm wrong. I think I'm pretty accurate about that. And then it becomes a question, what could their defense be?
Yeah, and consent is really not a defense to the other charges as well. When we look at sex trafficking, we look at what's the conduct of the trafficker, not so much what's the consent of the victim. For example, you can have cases where very heavily exploited individuals are like forced or coerced into sexual activity. It may be consensual sexual activity, or I shouldn't even say it like that.
Well, then it's not consensual. Then it wouldn't be consensual. That's the thing. In the end of the day, it wouldn't be consensual. I'm talking like straight up. I saw it in the Harvey Weinstein case too, right? There was a lot of questions about why were they going with him to X, Y, and Z? Why did they keep coming back? The whole focus was it consensual or not? And if they're saying, look, I know what I'm being accused of, but they knowingly came on these planes. They knew what was happening. They knowingly took drugs. Now they're coming out after the fact. It could be a very tough road for them, a very tough uphill battle. But again, there's no consent when it comes to a minor.
Yeah, that's right. I think, one thing that we'll probably see out of this is a defense kind of along the lines of what you just described. Like, look, these were, adult women that made their decisions. They wanted to come party with the Alexanders. They did drugs. And now this is being twisted around on them by these overzealous federal prosecutors. That's what we expect the defense to be. It's not something that you can allege when it comes to a minor. So that's going to be a much harder allegation to defend.
Do they just have to say, we have no idea who she is and none of this ever happened? That's their best bet?
Maybe they say she misrepresented her age. Maybe they say, that was one thing that was central in the Matt Gaetz investigation as well. What was the representations made about the age of the individual? Maybe they try something like that, but it's certainly hard to paint this theme of, look, we were just partying with these girls that like to party, and now this is being, manipulated by an overzealous prosecutor.
So now we have the other allegations, the other counts. So you fast forward to July of 2011. This one is specific to only Tal Alexander, accusing him of trafficking victim 1. The indictment alleges he caused victim 1 to engage in at least one commercial sex act, knowing and in reckless disregard of the fact that victim 1 was engaging in the commercial sex act as a result of force, fraud, and coercion. Then we have counts 3 and 4, along with 8 and 9. All of these pertain to victims 2 and 6. They deal not only with sex trafficking, but also with inducing or allegedly inducing these women to travel across state lines for illegal sex acts. Regarding victim 6, the indictment alleges that around August of 2014, Tal Alexander persuaded, induced, and enticed victim 6 to travel from Nevada to New York. Tal Alexander could engage and attempt to engage in unlawful sexual activity with victim 6. As for victim 2, the indictment alleges that in September of 2016, Alon Alexander, Oren Alexander, Tal Alexander persuaded, induced, and enticed victim 2 to travel from Illinois to New York so Alon, Oren, and Tal could engage and attempt to engage in unlawful sexual activity with victim 2. When you hear that, for prosecutors, establishing that pattern is key to this case, right?
It is, and it's part of the pattern they lay out in count 1. But I think that's what changes this from, a collection of sexual assaults that happen to have, related offenders into something that looks, at least on paper, more like a planned sex trafficking ring.
If there is a weakness in the account of any of these alleged victims, does that weaken the entire case? And tell me if I'm right about that. Does it become all the more important about who you call as your first or second witness?
Well, I think it's probably, yes, it certainly can. I mean, it depends on what the weakness is. If it's a lack of memory, then maybe no, it doesn't infect the others. But if it's something like there's a number of civil lawsuits that have been filed that we know of that are related to this, if there's something that makes one of the victims look like they're really out for money more than anything, that's the kind of thing that could taint larger perception of the case. And in regards to witnesses, I would presume that the prosecution has been very selective about which indictments they've been seeking in terms of, we talked about how there's dozens of women that are potentially at issue here. I imagine the prosecution has been selective about which ones they've sought indictments for and trying to avoid ones that they think might have problematic credibility issues.
When I think about the Alexander brothers, this case, it's just so eerily similar to what we've been seeing in other allegations. I mentioned the Combs case, right? Why haven't they been charged with RICO, racketeering? If they're talking about this conspiracy to sex traffic and this network of sex trafficking, why haven't they been charged with a RICO violation, racketeering?
That's a very good question. In general, RICO statutes and prosecutions are more complex than just the trafficking. They may have wanted to keep it simple, but it's a good question for sure.
Yeah, I mean, they might not have those predicate crimes like in the Combs case where they talk about alleged instances of kidnapping or forced labor or things of that. Although what's being described in this indictment, I could imagine they could have put together a racketeering case, but maybe it didn't quite fit. Maybe they weren't necessarily using their business resources to allegedly further criminal activity. It's interesting. But anyway, let me ask you this before I let you go. Oren and Alon, they face additional state charges in Florida for 3 alleged assaults. They've been charged alongside their family friend, Ohad Fisherman, who's been accused of acting as an accomplice, pleaded not guilty. Actually, according to the New York Times, Ohad Fisherman's actually going to be heading to trial next month. When you think about those state charges, how does that affect this case at all, the federal case, when you think about that interplay?
Yeah, well, it complicates it for sure for the Alexander brothers. In general, if you have charges pending in multiple jurisdictions, if it's all state charges, sometimes you can try to resolve cases collaboratively between the jurisdictions. The feds don't do that quite as much as you see in the state cases. So the only thing that'll be interesting is to see which of the two has priority. Quite often, the feds will kind of take priority over the prosecution, and the state has to wait, which can be detrimental to their case, but it could be a long process.
If this reporting is accurate and Fisherman goes to trial first, I wonder whether or not if he gets a guilty verdict and extensive prison time, or he pleads guilty, again, thinking about a potential cooperator with the government in the federal case.
Yeah, well, and it certainly can be a harbinger for what the jury thinks of these cases. A lot of times, defense attorneys will look and see how companion cases resolve in front of a jury, and that gives them some insight into what a jury might think of their clients.
John Clune, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
You bet, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.